It's the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 25, looking at the players of Euro 2024. This episode is looking at the players of Belgium. Here we go. Hello and welcome again to the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada. I'm Kevin and we continue Series 25 on the groups and players of the 2024 Euro Cup. This episode covers Belgium's players and is in fact part 2 of the Players Media Cast. And in this one, we look at the selections. In part 1, we made a list of the candidates and introduced them and their likelihood of making the squad. There is a link to that in the show notes. This episode will be divided into 2 sections. In section 1, we will look over the list we compiled in part 1 to see who made it and who didn't. And in section 2, we summarize the prizes in the selections and review injuries. Let's begin then, and actually just before section 1, we'll take a look at the preliminary squad there. So Belgium very simply named a 25-man final roster, so not even using the 26 players they were allowed, and they published that on May 28th before their warm-up game. So no preliminary squad there, just 25 men, and despite several injuries, which we'll talk about at the end or in section 2, no changes to the squad. All right, let's go to the review then of the list we created in part 1. And we see that manager Domenico Tedesco is still there, so not fired before the tournament. And we'll say that he was selected. Goalkeepers, so we had a definite candidate in Matt Sells, and he was selected. A likely candidate in Thomas Kaminski, and he too was selected. And then we had 2 possible candidates, Cohen Casteels and Arnaud Baudard. Casteels there was selected, and Arnaud Baudard was not, and possibly an injury playing a role in his non-selection, but we'll talk about that in section 2. I read a couple of articles expressing surprise that Thibaut Courtois was not selected. We had him as a possible but unlikely candidate. A lot of that was due to injury over the period from the beginning of 2023. So it really wasn't a surprise to us, but of course, their starter in World Cup 2022 and veteran goalkeeper not selected here. And when we look at the warm-up games, it's also a bit of a surprise. We did have Matt Sells starting 5 of their last 6 games, but in the warm-up games, it was Cohen Casteels starting both of those. So that kind of suggests that he will be the starter in the Cup. Moving on to defense and central defenders, we have Wout Faes as a definite candidate, and he was selected. And then 2 likely candidates in Jan Vertonghen and Zeno de Bast, and both of those were selected, despite Vertonghen having an injury tag on him, one of several that we'll talk about in section 2 here. 2 possible candidates. The first, Coney de Winter, was not selected, and neither was Amin Al-Dakil, but we kind of knew about that because he was carrying an injury, and again, something we'll talk about in the next section. 2 possible but unlikely candidates, Zeno Van Hoesten and Jorn Spiliers, neither of those selected either. Okay, to the left back position, and here we have our only new player added to the squad. I'll put him on the list. It's Maxime de Kuiper, and we'll come to him after we look at the main candidates. We have Arthur Thiat as a definite candidate, and He was selected despite another player with an injury concern, which we'll look at in part two. And then a bit of a surprise, our likely candidate, Olivier Duman, not selected. Um, and it seems like the new player, Maxime de Kuiper, basically took his position. So we'll introduce Maxime de Kuiper. Of course, all of the players that we say made the squad. There are no players on the preliminary squad, so basically he goes directly to the final selection here. Maxime de Kuiper is 22 years old and had not appeared for the national team prior to being called up for the warm-up games, or I guess prior to being named to the final squad, because those warm-up games came after the squad was announced. De Kuiper started one of those games and subbed into the other. So now has 2 caps for the national team, and he plays for Club Brugge in Belgium. And actually, he's not completely new. He was named to the preliminary squad for the 2022 World Cup. However, that was a massive preliminary squad of 55 players, so he was one among many there and hadn't been called up since that time. So his first appearance was in these warm-up games, and that's why he hadn't been on our radar. Anyway, Thiet and De Kuiper then, the 2 left backs selected, and Olivier Duman left at home. Right backs, we had a definite candidate in Timothy Castagna, and a possible candidate in Thomas Meunier. Both of those were selected, Castagna and Meunier selected, and we had a possible but unlikely candidate in Hugo Siquet, and he was not selected. Let's take a look at the warm-up squads for defense. So in the first game, they went with a 4-2-3-1, so that would be 2 central defenders there, but in the second game, it was a 3-man central defense. In both of them, Wout Faes was the only central defender to start both games. However, Thomas Meunier started as a right back in the first game, and as the left central defender in that 3-man defense in the second game. So quite versatile Meunier there, and starting both games. We also see in the first game De Kuiper, our new player on the squad, getting a start. And in the second game, Castagna started as the winger, the basically right back pushing up to the winger role. That was not the case on the left side, though, where we see an actual attacker playing in that winger role, which we'll talk about a bit later. Okay, let's go on to the midfield, beginning with defensive midfielder. We had a no definite candidate, but a likely candidate in Amadou Onana, and he was selected for the squad. Possible but unlikely candidate Mandela Keita not selected for the squad. So he's the only defensive midfielder, Amadou Onana, but we do have central midfielders to look at. In fact, a definite candidate, Aurel Mangala, was selected for the squad. We also had 3 likely candidates, the first of whom was Yuri Tielemans, and he was selected for the squad, but it's another injury concern we got to talk about. In fact, we have all sorts of them now, because Aster Vranks, the second likely candidate, also an injury concern, but selected nonetheless. Also selected, the third likely candidate, Arthur Vermeeren. He's going to be the only one without an injury tag on him, because we have our biggest surprise, Axel Witsel, also selected here. We had him in the retired category, and we weren't wrong to do that. He had announced his retirement in March of 2023, but was brought back in when the final squad was announced. So Axel Witsel um, uh, suddenly on the squad. However, he too is an injury concern. So we have a lot to look at in section 2. Moving on, we go straight up to the left attacking role. No, sorry, I'll talk about the warm-up games there. So in the first game, it was our defensive midfielder Onana alongside Vermeeren. And Onana actually did play both games with different partners, Vermeeren in the first and Mangala in the second game there. So we expect at least Onana to be a starter based on that information. Okay, now we can go up to the attacking midfield position, and we have a no definite candidates actually, but oops, let me find my spot here. But all 3 of our likely candidates were selected. So Yannick Carrasco, Leandro Trossard, and Jeremy Doku, actually labeled as a right winger, but we had moved him here because he played here more and does seem to play there more now. So we'll likely see him redesignated, his position recoded. Okay, so Carrasco, Trossard, Doku, all selected. We had a possible but unlikely candidate in Alexis Saelemaekers, and he was not selected. In terms of the warm-up games there, it was Yannick Carrasco playing in a left attacking midfield role in the first game. And in the second game, a 3-4-2-1 formation, we had Jeremy Doku playing as the winger and Kevin De Bruyne coming in as the left attacking midfielder. We'll meet him shortly, or we'll review him shortly here. Before we do, though, we're going to look at the right attack side, and here we have 2 candidates that I'm looking forward to seeing because neither of them have tournament experience. It's both of them definite candidates, Dodi Lukebakio and Johan Bakayoko, both selected for the squad. And in the warm-up games, Bakayoko got the start as the right attacking midfielder in game 1, but in fact it was Leandro Trossard coming across from the left and playing right attacking. Oh, sorry, yes, right attacking midfielder in that one. So we do see Belgium switching sides quite a bit. So it's not a shock, but I am a bit surprised that Lukebakio didn't get a start in either of those games. All right, moving on to central attackers. Here's where we find Kevin De Bruyne as a likely candidate. Likely because he was injured quite a bit during the period from the World Cup to March 2024, but definite candidate. We knew he would be as long as he was fit, Kevin De Bruyne. So, and he, of course, was selected. And that's it. That's all we had in this category. And as we saw, Kevin De Bruyne playing right attacking midfielder in the second game. But in the first game, the 4-2-3-1, they had a central attacking midfielder, and it was he who played it. So Kevin De Bruyne starting both games there. And we move on to the forwards. And here we have Romelu Lukaku as a definite candidate. Also definite Lois Openda, both of those players selected. Here comes our next surprise. Michi Batshuayi. I used to be able to say this. Batshuayi was a likely candidate for us based on his participation, but not selected for the squad. Surprising in a way that they didn't use him for their 26th spot, but instead went with 25 players. Anyway, Michi Batshuayi, we won't be seeing him at this tournament. Instead, we may be seeing Charles de Ketelaere, our possible candidate who was selected. So 3 forwards there, and that is it. We have 25 players for Belgium, and we move on to section 2. No, we don't. We want to look at who played in the warm-up game. So in the first game, in both games, it was a single forward, as Belgium usually goes with. Lois Openda in the first game, Romelu Lukaku in the second. So no surprises there either. Okay, but we do have some surprises for you in section 2, and that is a couple of notable non-selections. So we had the Olivier Deman, the left midfielder. We had him as a likely candidate, but he was not chosen. And Michy Batshuayi, also a likely candidate, the forward, who was not chosen either. Having made the last 4 tournaments in a row, Batshuayi misses this one. Surprise inclusions. Well, we'd have to say Axel Witsel coming out of retirement to play in the cup, but we're going to be talking about him right away here in the injuries section. Finally, new players. Just one left back, Maxim de Kuiper, joining the squad here. Let's take a look at injuries then. And well, I mean, in a way, we can say all of these players are recovered from injury because they're named to the squad. And that's usually our basis for thinking that someone is recovered if they're selected. However, certainly not in this case are all of these players recovered. And it might be that, how many do we have? 5 or 6. That's 20% of the squad. It might be that all of these players are are sitting with injury. So we'll call them injury doubts, but still on the roster. The first is central defender Jan Vertonghen. He was out with a hamstring injury since mid-May and an unknown return date. And in fact, he is still listed that way at the beginning of the tournament here. And yet he was selected. They would have known about that hamstring injury for a long time. So I guess they're expecting him to be recovered during the tournament, or maybe even at the start of it. But we have him still listed as an injury concern. Next, Arthur Theat. His too was known. He picked up an ankle injury in the second last club game of the season, and he was out for the 2 warm-up games as well. And nevertheless, he is selected. And none of these players were reconsidered and replaced. So Arthur Theat, an injury doubt, and we'll really have to wait for the tournament to see what becomes of these. Axel Witsel, a bit of a different case. He got injured in the second warm-up game and subbed out. He's now listed with a groin injury and an unknown return date. But again, they had the opportunity to replace and did not. So Axel Witsel, just a doubt here, and they're obviously hoping he'll recover enough to play, to be available. Next, Thomas Meunier. We saw that he started both games, and 16 minutes into the second warm-up game, he subbed out injured and is now listed with a partial muscle tear and expected back on June 23rd. So that would mean missing the second game, I do believe. But definitely not available for the first game, Thomas Meunier. I'm really surprised they didn't bring in a couple of other players for this, but I suppose they know what they're doing. Finally, we have Yuri Tielemans in the same situation, really. He's in the same situation as the first 2, where his injury was known. He was listed with a groin injury from early May, and that seemed to be a reoccurring injury. It kept him out of the last game of the season. He was selected nonetheless, but is still listed as an injury with an unknown return date at the start of the tournament. So all 5 of those players injury doubts going into the tournament. We also have a couple of players who were injured but were not strong candidates, so we're not really sure what role the injury played in the decision to leave them off the squad. The first is goalkeeper Arnaud Baudard. He seemed like a kind of an outside chance anyway, but he had a minor knock since late April. I don't think he would agree that it's a minor knock, because that is unchanged at the start of the tournament. So he's had it for a long time. An unknown return date for him. But again, looking at the candidates for goalkeepers, it looked like it would be really an outside chance for his selection. The other one is Amin Al-Dakil, and we knew he was going to be off the squad, out with a muscle injury since mid-February, and wasn't expected back until June 30th. So we were able to talk about that in part one. Again, Amin Al-Dakil, maybe the injury, well, obviously the injury played a role and made it impossible, but we don't know if he would have been selected had he been healthy. Okay, that is it. That completes our part two look at Belgium, the candidates, and the strange injury situation. So we'll really be keeping an eye on that in the Cup to see which of those players are available. I think for sure a lot of them will be out for the first game, but that they were kept on the squad suggests that they're hoping that they will be recovered as the tournament progresses. Hope this helped you enjoy the Cup. We would like to thank Mike Kripak, Make Sound Music, and Pixabay for the wonderful background music called Dance 90s accompanying this mediacast.